Can you believe that an entire, thriving civilization, a city built on the pinnacle of Roman luxury and arrogance, could vanish from the face of the earth in less than 24 hours? Not by invading barbarians, not by plague, but by the very ground they walked on, by a silent, brooding giant they had mistaken for a friendly hill. This is not just history. This is the true, terrifying story of Pompeii, the ultimate betrayal by Mother Nature, a catastrophe no one saw coming, even though the mountain had been screaming warnings for 17 agonizing years. We are about to witness the final, agonizing moments of a city that chose opulence over survival, a city that died because it believed itself immortal. Imagine the scene. It is the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. The air above the Bay of Naples is thick and warm, smelling of salt and freshly baked bread and the rich musk of 1,000 different perfumes. Everything is perfect. The sun is blazing down on the terracotta roofs, reflecting off the intricate mosaic floors of opulent villas and illuminating the vibrant, bloody frescoes that decorated every wall. In the bustling forum, the pulsing heart of the city, magistrates are shouting decrees, vendors are hawking exotic spices from the east, and the local baker, named Albus, is tending to his massive stone oven, completely oblivious that in a few hours, that very oven will become his tomb, sealing him in a final, terrifying embrace.
They were Romans. They believed they had conquered the world and subdued the very elements. They had public baths heated by ingenious subterranean fires, roads paved for legions marching thousands of miles, and a complex water system that mocked the engineering capabilities of any society before or since. Why then would they fear a mountain? Vesuvius, to them, was just a beautiful backdrop, a vineyard-covered giant that provided the richest, most fertile soil and the sweetest, most intoxicating grapes in the entire empire. It was a sign of abundance, a symbol of prosperity, not a harbinger of unspeakable, absolute doom. They had literally built their magnificent, sprawling paradise directly on top of a primed, ticking time bomb, and they treated it like a scenic overlook.
But the earth had been restless, terribly restless. For nearly 2 decades, great tremors had been shaking their foundations, like a child shaking a toy. In 62 AD, a massive earthquake had struck, leveling huge sections of Pompeii and its neighbor Herculaneum, leaving scars so deep they were visible across the entire region. It was the warning shot, the screaming siren that should have caused mass evacuation. Instead of fleeing or seeking deep divine intervention and abandoning the cursed ground, what did these arrogant, wealthy Romans do? They rebuilt. And they didn't just rebuild, they dramatically upgraded. They used the destruction as an excuse to make their city even more luxurious, more defiant against fate, pouring every ounce of imperial wealth into monumental reconstruction projects that were still incomplete on that final morning. They silenced the gnawing fear with concrete and marble, choosing willful, deliberate blindness over basic, fundamental survival instinct. They ignored the rumbling earth, the shifting water levels, the strange smells of sulfur that occasionally wafted down the slopes, dismissing it all as normal geological activity. The morning of August 24th, offered no visual warning whatsoever. The sky was perfectly clear, an unblemished azure dome. Pliny the Younger, who would become the primary, horrified witness to this horror show, was miles away, likely enjoying a tranquil academic morning at his uncle's estate in Misenum. In Pompeii itself, the early hours were dominated by the utterly mundane. Slaves were grinding grain, patricians were debating politics and the cost of grain in the taverns, and children were playing with worn dice in the shadowed alleyways. Normalcy was the city's greatest, most lethal curse. Then, around noon, the perfect, deadly midpoint of the day, the quiet ended. It did not start with a great, terrifying roar that would have sent everyone scrambling, but with a deep, sickening subterranean rumble that wasn't loud enough to stop a conversation, but was deep enough to make the wine glasses vibrate violently on the marble tables. It was the sound of bedrock tearing apart, the sound of 16 miles of compressed, explosive magma finally finding a sudden, violent release valve. High above, Vesuvius, that tranquil, gentle giant, was tearing open its very throat, initiating an eruption so vast it would change the climate of the known world for months. Imagine the confusion, the sheer, paralyzing disbelief. One moment, blazing sun and loud commerce. The next, a colossal pillar of smoke rising miles into the blue sky, shaped exactly like a massive, terrifying pine tree. Dark, oily, and intensely menacing. This was not a standard brush fire. This was the mountain breathing, expelling the toxic guts of the earth. Pliny, watching from across the bay, described it, even from that distance, as a sight of impossible, paralyzing terror. A cloud of such magnitude and unimaginable violence that it seemed to be holding the entire sky captive, choking the life out of the atmosphere itself. The first phase was deceptively, terrifyingly slow. Ash, fine and gray, began to fall. It looked like a sudden, aggressive, bizarre snowstorm, coating the streets and the roofs, settling on the shoulders of the confused citizens. The populace initially reacted with intense curiosity, not panic. Some residents even took buckets onto their roofs, trying to sweep away this bizarre, gritty snowfall, thinking it was just a strange, localized weather event, something that would surely pass by sundown. They were monumentally, tragically wrong. Within the next hour, the ash was no longer fine powder. It was raining down in chunks the size of small fists, mixed with hot pumice stones, heavy enough and hot enough to start small, spontaneous fires wherever they landed. The weight began to accumulate rapidly, relentlessly. Rooftops that had stood for centuries began to groan loudly under the impossible, relentless burden of millions of tons of volcanic debris. The sky, minutes ago a perfect Mediterranean blue, had turned an apocalyptic, sulfurous orange, plunging the entire city into a preternatural, choking twilight at the absolute height of the day. This was the precise moment the terrifying realization truly dawned. They were trapped. Their carefully constructed, arrogant world had become a cage of stone and ash. Roads were already beginning to clog with debris and panicked carts. The harbor, their only viable escape route by sea, was blocked by chaotic, debris-filled waves and thick, blinding fog. People scrambled, desperate. They grabbed jewelry, they grabbed gold, they grabbed their children, but they made one fatal, deadly error.
They paused. They paused to debate which direction to run. They paused to secure their wealth. They paused to seek protection indoors, believing in their hubris, that stone walls and thick roofs could somehow shield them from the wrath of a vengeful mountain. They didn't understand the physics of the devastation bearing down on them. They didn't know that the ash was already thickening, turning the streets into a soft, inescapable quicksand that was trapping the elderly and the slow. And they certainly didn't know that the true killer, the absolute, undeniable end of Pompeii, had not even arrived yet. The first 6 hours were just the dreadful setup. The final, terrifying act of suffocation and incineration was still waiting, silent, just above the poisoned clouds, ready to descend and erase every trace of their existence. Their quiet mourning was about to become the loudest silence the world had ever known.
It wasn't the sound of thunder. It was the sound of geology screaming. The accumulated pressure of centuries finally finding its catastrophic release in a blast that was heard not just across the Bay of Naples, but across the entire Mediterranean world, shaking windows in distant Africa. 17 years of tremors, of subterranean whispers they had dismissed as the irritable grumbling of the earth god Vulcan, were synthesized into one cataclysmic roar that traveled instantly across the sun-drenched city, freezing every citizen mid-sip, mid-bargain, mid-prayer. They looked up, instinctively, toward the magnificent green slope of Vesuvius, the mountain they had tamed with vineyards and pleasure villas, and saw something impossible, something that defied the Roman order of the universe. A pillar of smoke and pulverized rock, black as night at its base and brilliantly white at its crown, punched through the perfect blue sky. This was not a forest fire. This was the planet literally exhaling its core. It soared, higher and faster than any man-made structure, reaching an unimaginable altitude of 20 miles into the stratosphere, forming that iconic, terrible shape, described later by the only survivor who truly documented the event, a gigantic Mediterranean pine tree, its trunk rooted in Hades, its branches spreading divine wrath across the entire Campania region. The sheer mechanics of this opening act were terrifying in their scope. Within the first 90 minutes, Vesuvius had ejected 4 cubic kilometers of material. That is, 4 billion tons of molten rock, gas, and ash, thrown upward at speeds exceeding hundreds of miles per hour. This was an energy output equivalent to several thousand simultaneous atomic bomb detonations, all focused with chilling precision on a few square miles of unsuspecting Roman paradise, instantly transforming the atmosphere from crystal clarity into an oppressive, suffocating darkness. And then the rain began. Not water, but a chilling downpour of fine gray powder, quickly followed by something far worse, lapilli. The Romans, paralyzed by disbelief, initially thought it was merely dirt, soot, or perhaps some peculiar localized storm that would soon pass. But lapilli, small porous fragments of cooling magma, essentially white-hot lightweight stone, began to fall with increasing, violent intensity. They were the size of walnuts, sometimes even larger, still radiating the furnace heat of the mantle. The city, which just hours ago was a vibrant tapestry of color and life, instantly became monochrome, draped in a suffocating blanket of gray. The light dimmed rapidly, turning the vibrant midday sun into a terrifying, unnatural twilight that fostered immediate, unbridled panic. This first phase, known as the Plinian Fall, lasted for approximately 18 agonizing hours, a marathon of terror that systematically dismantled every roof and every last vestige of hope in Pompeii. The weight began to accumulate relentlessly, silent in its destruction, yet devastatingly effective. Experts estimate that the ash and pumice were falling at a rate of 6 inches per hour, a rate that allowed people to move, but simultaneously paralyzed them with the sheer scale of the environmental collapse. This stage demanded immediate, decisive action. Abandon everything, grab only what you could carry, and run south, against the prevailing wind, toward safety. But the ingrained Roman architectural arrogance became their fatal flaw. They relied on the solidity of their tiled roofs and the thick walls of their villas, believing they offered infallible shelter from the airborne assault. This was the ultimate, tragic miscalculation. Those seemingly harmless, lightweight fragments of lapilli and ash were accumulating at a terrifying density. By late afternoon, the roofs, particularly the flat ones over the public baths, shops, and courtyards, were holding thousands of pounds of pulverized rock. The pressure on every square foot quickly exceeded 70 pounds, a structural impossibility for even the best Roman construction techniques. The sound of the mountain's sustained roar was soon joined by a new, horrifying sound, the splintering crack of wood beams giving way, followed by the deafening crush of terracotta collapsing inward. Thousands of citizens who sought safety indoors were not instantly incinerated. They were slowly, agonizingly crushed in the dark, suffocating confines of their own homes, entombed by the very structures they had built to protect their lives of leisure. The ash, mixed with vaporized sulfuric acid condensing high in the column, also began to clog the air. The sulfurous compounds burned the throat and lungs, making breathing a painful, desperate struggle, even before the weight began to press down on their chests. The air itself was thick, not only with rock, but with microscopic fragments of glass created when the magma violently cooled, a deadly, abrasive powder that shredded lung tissue with every panicked gasp. Their proud city, designed to last 1,000 years, was being slowly, deliberately buried, brick by brick, under a monument of cosmic debris. The mountain had not just erupted. It had begun its final, methodical act of quiet, crushing execution, turning shelter into a prison.
The early afternoon of August 24th, 79 AD, was no longer a matter of weathering a storm. It was a matter of mathematics, dictated by the relentless physics of weight and gravity. Every single soul who had sought refuge beneath a tiled roof, believing the robust Roman architecture would save them, had just made a terrible, fatal calculation. The irony was devastating. The structures built to protect them had become perfectly designed traps, waiting for the invisible hand of Vesuvius to trigger the spring.
The initial deluge of pumice, while terrifying and painful, was primarily a structural hazard. But now, as the eruption entered its second hour, the smaller, denser lapilli began to fall. The volcanic hail mixed with fine, suffocating ash. This mixture settled with a density that defied imagination, accumulating not in inches, but in feet, minute by minute, pressing down on every beam and rafter. Imagine the scene. Inside the opulent atrium of the House of the Vetii, a family huddles, praying to Jupiter for deliverance. They can hear the terrifying, grinding scrape of rock piling up above their heads, a sound like 1,000 slaves moving the heaviest stones in the quarry. Only this workforce was invisible, unstoppable, and entirely inorganic. This sound was the true heartbeat of the city's impending demise. The Roman roof, typically built for rain and Mediterranean sun, was structurally sound, designed to hold the weight of men performing repairs, but never the weight of half a mountain. When geologists later calculated the load, they estimated that within the initial 2 hours of the eruption's Plinian phase, the roofs of Pompeii were bearing an average stress of nearly 150 kilograms per square meter. That is an impossible burden, a slow-motion catastrophe guaranteed to find the weakest point in the structure, seeking out the oldest mortar or the most compromised truss. And when the weakest point gave way, it didn't just leak ash onto the floor. It collapsed with a terrifying, instantaneous finality, becoming a stone guillotine for those sheltering below, crushing them instantly beneath tons of debris. The air outside was now completely unbreathable. Visibility plummeted to zero, transforming the once vibrant streets into a blinding, scorching blizzard. Those who dared to venture out found themselves moving through a blizzard of burning hot grit, eyes streaming, lungs seizing from the toxic air. The fine particles of pulverized rock were not just dust, they were silica, sharper than glass shards, tearing apart the delicate tissues of the respiratory system with every panicked, shallow breath.
The citizens who survived the initial roof collapse found themselves facing the agonizing decision: stay in the quickly shrinking, dust-filled tomb, or risk the poisoned hellscape outside. Many chose the former, believing with desperate, foolish optimism that the mountain must exhaust itself, clinging to the desperate hope that sunrise would bring relief and clear air, a fundamental misunderstanding of the cosmic forces unleashed. But Vesuvius was far from exhausted. The earth was now shaking violently again. Not the familiar rumble of minor quakes that preceded the event, but a deep, resonant shudder that signaled a profound geological change within the magma chamber itself. The column of smoke, which had already reached heights of 20 miles, piercing the stratosphere, darkening the entire Mediterranean basin, was about to change its character entirely, signaling the shift from eruption to gravitational collapse. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the Bay of Naples in Misenum, miles away and still in relative safety, described the colossal cloud as resembling a massive pine tree, its trunk rising impossibly high before spreading out into a dense, deadly canopy. This terrifying visual, dramatic and impossible to ignore, was the last, most crucial warning the remaining survivors received, a signal fire of their approaching doom.
Because below that towering canopy, a new dynamic was forming. The sheer volume of material being ejected began to destabilize the column itself, a towering monument to destruction that could no longer support its own weight. When the volcanic column reaches this critical point of instability, gravity wins the battle against explosive force, and the entire structure begins to fall back down to Earth, accelerating exponentially. This wasn't mere ash fall anymore. This was the beginning of the end, the formation of the first surge cloud, the most lethal mechanism of volcanic destruction known to man. It began quietly, insidiously, a cloud of superheated gas and razor-sharp rock particles that hugged the slopes of Vesuvius, gathering momentum with deadly intent. It was silent, deadly, and moved with the speed of a charging Roman chariot. While Pompeii was still struggling with roof collapses and suffocating ash, its sister city, Herculaneum, situated closer to the mountain's base and directly in the path of the coming destruction, was about to experience the true meaning of instantaneous annihilation. The people of Herculaneum, having seen the terrifying eruption begin hours earlier, had largely fled towards the sea, seeking refuge in the boat sheds, believing the water offered ultimate safety and an escape route. They clustered together, hundreds of souls pressed into these dark, arched chambers, waiting for rescue that would never, ever arrive, believing distance was their protection. Their fate, however, was sealed by a terrifying paradox. They had avoided the choking, slow death of the ashfall that plagued Pompeii, only to be met by the first concentrated wave of true pyroclastic fury. This wave, designated Surge 1, would hit Herculaneum just after midnight, traveling downhill at an unimaginable velocity, a silent, burning wall of death. It was a blast furnace materialized, a mixture of gas heated to over 500 degrees Celsius, capable of incinerating flesh and boiling blood in milliseconds upon contact. When it struck Herculaneum, it didn't bury the people slowly. It flash vaporized their soft tissues, leaving only the skeletons encased in hardened rock, a ghastly, silent snapshot of horror frozen in time, perfectly preserved in their final moment of terror. Pompeii was still spared this immediate, catastrophic flow due to its slightly greater distance and the prevailing winds initially pushing the main eruption column southeast. But the mountain was only resetting its sights, repositioning its inevitable final attack. The survivors in Pompeii, unaware of the horror unfolding minutes away, continued to fight the ceaseless, crushing weight of the pumice, preparing for a night they would not survive. The pressure cooker was building. The initial phase had trapped them, collapsed their defenses, and poisoned their air. The next phase, the one destined to end the 17,000-year history of the city and its arrogant inhabitants, was now speeding across the dark slopes toward them, bringing the final, definitive silence. The quiet execution was almost complete, and the mountain was ready to claim its final victims. The quiet execution was indeed almost complete, but the mountain was not content with mere burial. It was ready to unleash the final, unimaginable horror, a force so alien and terrifying that the Roman mind, accustomed to conquering armies, could not possibly process its destructive power. This was not lava. This was not ashfall. This was the pyroclastic surge, the very breath of Vesuvius, a superheated hurricane of gas, pulverized rock, and lethal steam, moving at the speed of a projectile and carrying temperatures that redefined death. The first surge struck with the violence of a geological sledgehammer, not against Pompeii, which was still choking under meters of white pumice, but against the coastal settlement of Herculaneum. This poor town, downwind and closer to the immediate throat of the volcano, received the immediate, instantaneous kiss of death around 1 a.m. on August 25th. It was the perfect, terrifying test run for the mountain's final act. The temperature spike was immediate, leaping to perhaps 300 to 500 degrees Celsius in a blink. This heat was so absolute, so fast, that it bypassed the usual processes of decay or burning. Instead, it achieved something far more gruesome: instantaneous, catastrophic thermal shock. The unfortunate inhabitants, huddled in their boathouses, thinking the thick walls of Roman concrete would save them from the storm outside, were vaporized internally. Their brains boiled, their soft tissues flash-cooked, and their skeletal systems experienced a phenomenon known as rapid defleshing. In the most horrifying cases found later by archaeologists, the intensity of the heat caused their skulls to explode. This was not a natural death. It was an erasure by pure thermal energy. Herculaneum's citizens were not buried. They were instantly mummified by the heat, frozen forever in their final panicked poses. a silent, chilling monument to the mountain's unfathomable rage. Meanwhile, the survivors in Pompeii, trapped in their ash-shrouded, lightless labyrinth, remained ignorant of the fate of their neighbors. They were focused on the localized, brutal death descending upon them, the sheer, crushing weight of the pumice.
The initial ashfall was now intermixed with denser, heavier lapilli, raining down relentlessly, piling up in the narrow streets and on the flat roofs of the villas. The weight was astronomical, hundreds of tons per structure, settling with silent, lethal efficiency. They listened in the darkness, the only sound the terrifying rhythmic cracks of structural supports giving way, followed by the muffled screams of those crushed beneath their own ceilings. Escape was impossible. The streets were buried too deep, the air too thick with choking dust.
Their only hope was to shelter in the strongest remaining buildings, such as the public baths or the robust stone basements, unaware that these stone structures were about to become perfect ovens when the real terror arrived. The eruption column, which had stood proud and terrifying for 18 hours, finally began to collapse, signifying the shift from the Plinian phase, the column of ash, to the Palean phase, the surges. This collapse unleashed the full, terrifying power of the mountain directly toward Pompeii. At around 6:30 a.m., after a night of suffocating suspense, the first major pyroclastic surge, Surge 2, following the deadly test on Herculaneum, finally rolled over the remains of Pompeii's northern walls. It was low-lying, fast, and devastatingly hot. This was the end of the line for the thousands who had survived the ashfall. They had endured the darkness, the weight, and the choking air, only to be met by a wall of incandescent death, moving faster than they could even register its presence. The surge was pure kinetic and thermal force. It scoured the city, seeking out every crevice, every alleyway, every hiding spot where desperate families were praying to gods who had clearly abandoned them. The heat, though perhaps slightly less intense than the wave that hit Herculaneum, was still instantly lethal, hot enough to sear the lungs and cause immediate cardiac arrest. This is the moment etched into history forever. Those famous plaster casts we study today are not just artifacts. They are the perfect, macabre record of this exact instant. The victims were killed so suddenly, frozen in their final, desperate acts of self-preservation. A father shielding his son. A woman clutching a mantle over her face. The gladiator covering his head. The fine, wet ash that immediately followed the deadly heat enveloped their bodies, creating a perfect mold. When the soft tissues eventually decomposed, they left behind a hollow, a void in the hardened layer of volcanic debris. This void, when filled with plaster centuries later, captured their final, agonizing moment, the absolute, instantaneous terror of facing a non-human entity that simply melted their reality. The terror was repeated relentlessly. Vesuvius was thorough. Over the next hour, Surge 3, Surge 4, and finally Surge 5 swept through the area, overlapping the initial destruction, ensuring the total, absolute annihilation of all life in a 12-mile radius. By 8 a.m. on August 25th, 79 AD, the eruption had largely subsided. The column dissipated, the earth stopped shaking, and a horrifying silence descended. Pompeii, the boastful, arrogant city of peak Roman luxury, was gone.
It was not merely destroyed, it was meticulously erased, sealed beneath 7 to 8 meters of solid, compressed debris, an eternal tomb where the air itself had become the executioner. The warnings, ignored for 17 years, had finally been validated, not by a tremor, but by the quiet, definitive silence of oblivion.
The worst had passed, or so the few thousand broken, terrified souls still clinging to life believed. The apocalyptic column of ash and fire, which had dominated the sky for nearly a full day, had finally begun to shrink, retracting its deadly umbrella. A suffocating stillness fell over the gray, rock-choked ruins of Pompeii, a silence infinitely more terrifying than the roar of the eruption itself. The air was still impossible to breathe, thick with pulverized crystal and sulfur, tasting like the bitter end of the world. But the bombardment of white-hot pumice stones had ceased. Survivors, those who had managed to carve out air pockets in the depths of their cellars or beneath the reinforced beams of their taverns, began to claw their way back toward the light, toward a false dawn. They were covered in meters of gray death, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. They thought they had cheated the mountain. They were tragically, monumentally wrong. Vesuvius had merely paused, not surrendered. The initial Plinian phase, the spectacular, high-altitude eruption that had buried the city in rock, was merely the overture. The true, definitive act of destruction, the lethal pyroclastic flows, was about to begin. An execution delivered at the speed of sound and the heat of a furnace.
High above the devastated city, the massive column of eruption material, no longer sustained by the pressure of explosive gas, began to lose structural integrity. It buckled, it twisted, and then, with a silent, catastrophic sigh, the entire mass collapsed down the mountain's flanks, flowing outward like an avalanche of pure, incandescent oblivion.
This was not a cloud. This was the thermal kiss of death, traveling at speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour. A dense, ground-hugging current of superheated gas, pulverized rock, and lethal ash, roaring down the slopes like a demon chasing its prey. The temperature within this invisible wave was estimated to be between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius. Survival was not a factor. Instantaneous destruction was the only outcome. While Pompeii was still encased in its layers of protective pumice, the sister city of Herculaneum, situated closer to the summit and directly in the path of the first major surge, faced instant annihilation. Imagine the hundreds of desperate citizens huddled in the boathouses along the shore, waiting for rescue, only to be met by a wall of heat so profound that their bodies did not even have time to burn. The scientific evidence is clear and horrifying. The thermal shock was so absolute that flesh vaporized, muscle tissue violently contracted, and their brains boiled inside their skulls before they could even register the pain. Their skeletons were found centuries later, twisted in poses of final, agonizing spasm, their organic matter instantly carbonized, a definitive stamp of Vesuvius's pure, unadulterated power. This first surge, the most brutal, bypassed Pompeii, but it was a dire warning of the fate to come. Over the next 6 hours, Vesuvius unleashed not one, but 6 distinct pyroclastic surges, each one a deadly iteration of the last, ensuring no stone and no life was left unturned. The 4th and 5th surges were the ones that sealed Pompeii's fate. They were slightly cooler than the blast that decimated Herculaneum, but they were no less deadly. Sweeping in through the northern gates and across the field of the gladiators, the superheated gas ripped through the thick blanket of pumice, scouring it away and exposing the trapped inhabitants beneath. Those few thousand who had survived the night, who had cheered their false victory, now faced an enemy they could not fight, could not outrun, and they barely even see. It was not fire, but the breath of the mountain, a thick, suffocating wave of heat and ash that filled every cavity, every lung, every open space. The horror of the Pompeian casts, those haunting, frozen figures that define the tragedy, are the direct result of this sudden thermal shock. As the 300-degree C gas hit the exposed skin, the body's fluids turned instantly to steam, causing the rapid contraction of muscles and the definitive, agonizing rigor mortis that froze them in their final, desperate postures. The mother shielding her child, the gladiator covering his face, the dog chained to its post, each one is a momentary snapshot of a life arrested by an invisible executioner. They died not of suffocation under ash, as previously believed, but of acute thermal shock, instantaneous death delivered faster than the speed of human realization. This was the end game. The mountain had played a long, cruel game of cat and mouse, first burying them, then luring them out with a deceptive calm, only to deliver the final, definitive blow of pure, scorching oblivion. Beneath the 6 meters of material, the vibrant, arrogant city of Pompeii became an eternal tomb, perfectly preserved, perfectly silent, a museum dedicated to the fragility of human existence and the ultimate betrayal of the earth beneath our feet. The Roman hubris that had dismissed the tremors for 17 years had been answered not with a roar, but with a series of silent, inescapable surges. The last sound anyone heard in the forum, in the lavish villas, or in the cramped bakeries, was likely nothing more than a gasp, followed by the terrifying, all-encompassing silence of geologic history claiming its rightful place. That silence, however, was not the end. It was the sickening, dramatic pause between the two main acts of Vesuvius's ultimate theatrical performance. Those poor souls, buried under 6, 7, 8 feet of insulating, abrasive white pumice, might have believed, in the agonizing dark, that they had successfully survived the wrath of the gods, the fiery rain finally spent. They were wrong, terribly, utterly wrong. They had survived the relatively slow pumice fall, the rain of stones, only to face the arrival of the geological reaper itself, a force so fundamentally alien to the Roman mind that they had no lexicon to describe the blinding, instantaneous inferno approaching the city walls.
Vesuvius was not finished clearing its throat. It was just loading the next, far deadlier projectile. The second act, the true executioner of Pompeii, was already racing down the slopes of the mountain, a relentless, physics-defying torrent of annihilation.
This was not the relatively cool first surge that had flash-fried Herculaneum's outer edge hours earlier. This was a monster born directly from the catastrophic collapse of the volcano's massive eruptive column, the infamous pyroclastic density current 4, the flow that signed Pompeii's death warrant.
Imagine a dense, ground-hugging cloud moving faster than the fastest chariot in the Circus Maximus, traveling at speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, utterly silent until it was upon you. This wasn't mere smoke. It was an avalanche of thermal energy, an airborne furnace where the temperature hovered somewhere between 480 and 570 degrees Fahrenheit, and possibly searingly higher in its core.
It defied gravity, flowing not just down ravines, but flattening out across the flat plains of the Sarno Valley, an unstoppable, incandescent wave of death designed specifically to seek out and erase every pocket of breathable air and every shadow of life hidden beneath the pumice layers. For the hundreds, perhaps thousands, still huddled in cellars, in the sheltered alcoves of the great public baths, or those who had foolishly taken shelter inside the stone walls of the Stabian Gate, their final moments were not one of agonizing burning, but of sudden, unimaginable thermal shock. The sheer kinetic energy and heat of the surge punched effortlessly through the thick layer of insulating pumice and the thin walls of the structures like a high-powered blowtorch through silk. It flash-heated the trapped air instantaneously, turning the sealed atmosphere into a lethal, pressurized oven that didn't just kill, it pulverized the cellular structure of life itself. The forensic evidence, the ghostly plaster casts recovered by Giuseppe Fiorelli centuries later, tells the chilling, undeniable truth. These people didn't have time to scream or even lift a hand in defense. Their bodies reacted involuntarily to the impossible heat. Muscles contracted violently, instantly dehydrating and tightening, causing their limbs to draw in and their heads to snap back in what archaeologists chillingly refer to as the boxer position, a macabre reflex caused by the extreme, rapid application of heat. One moment, they were struggling in the suffocating darkness, choked by ash and breathing shallowly. The next, their soft tissues were cooked solid, their internal organs carbonized, all in a fraction of a second, before the body even had time to register a single flicker of pain. This was the breathtaking, terrifying efficiency of true geological annihilation. The force of this specific flow was monumental. It wasn't just blistering heat, it was immense, destructive pressure. Stone pillars supporting porticos were snapped like dry twigs. Roof tiles, which had miraculously withstood the initial pumice rain, were now ripped off and hurled hundreds of yards by the gale force pressure wave preceding the flow. The surge acted like a terrifying geological cement mixer, blending ultra-fine ash, sharp rock shards, and superheated gas into a thick, suffocating slurry that instantly filled every cavity, every sewer line, every water cistern. When the heat passed and the remaining particulate dust settled, that fine ash was the final nail in Pompeii's coffin. It was a cement-like volcanic compound that, when mixed with the ambient steam and moisture, hardened almost immediately, creating the perfect, airtight, impenetrable shell around everything it touched. This final process didn't just bury the city, it preserved it, capturing the absolute final instant of life in horrifying, crystalline detail, locking the city in a time capsule of terror for the next 1,700 years, an artifact of pure geological cruelty. The irony was harsh, exquisite in its dramatic horror. The city that boasted the greatest feats of Roman engineering, the finest frescoes, the unparalleled luxury, villas dedicated to Dionysian revelry and the pursuit of perfect leisure, was now just a vast, silent mausoleum, sealed forever by the very earth they had so arrogantly taken for granted. Consider the famed Villa of the Mysteries, deep within the protective embrace of its sturdy walls. Even here, the pyroclastic flow found its way, silencing the laughter and freezing the artistic legacy forever beneath layers of deathly gray cement. The magnificent marble statuary, the intricate mosaics depicting mythological heroes, the very tools of the craftsman, the half-eaten loaf of bread on the baker's counter, all were instantly sealed, coated in a suffocating layer of fine particulate matter, like historical artifacts shrink-wrapped by a monstrous, sentient force.
By the time the sun should have risen on the morning of August 25th, 79 AD, Pompeii was gone, not damaged, not abandoned, but utterly erased, buried so completely that the ancient world eventually forgot its exact location for nearly 2 millennia.
The only hint that a thriving, arrogant civilization had existed there was the ghostly plume still rising from Vesuvius's summit, a grim monument to the mountain's swift, decisive victory over the hubris of man.
The silence that followed the unimaginable noise was perhaps the most terrifying sound of all. It was the definitive stamp of Vesuvius, proclaiming its absolute dominion, the sound of history hitting a brick wall. The sky, minutes earlier a churning inferno of black and gray, began to clear, just enough to reveal a sickly, bruised sun struggling to penetrate the fine, powdery particulate, still hanging miles high in the atmosphere.
The temperature dropped back toward survivable levels, but the air remained thick with sulfurous fumes and the metallic tang of vaporized human remains, an atmosphere less like Earth and more like the desolate landscape of Hades itself. For those few thousand souls who had managed to outrun the swift, pulverizing flows, fleeing down the roads toward Stabiae or Nuceria, the world they left behind was not merely damaged, it was geometrically erased. Pompeii was not merely covered, it was chemically and physically sealed beneath a geologic deposit of terrifying efficiency. The material that rained down, a mixture of hot pumice, fine ash, and jagged lithic fragments, was not soft soil, but a dense, suffocating blanket that quickly began to cement together, hardening into the consistency of porous concrete. In the lower residential areas and near the River Sarno, the depth of the deposit reached an astonishing 25 feet, a subterranean tomb perfectly tailored to preserve the final, agonizing moments of its inhabitants in agonizing detail. This was the ultimate burial, a complete and total withdrawal of the city from the surface world, ensuring that no grave robbers, and certainly no survivors, could ever pierce its dense geological seal. But the true tragedy was not just the depth of the burial, but the speed of the forgetting. In Rome, 150 miles to the north, Emperor Titus was grappling with a catastrophe that felt impossibly distant, a localized disaster on the periphery of his vast and demanding empire. While he immediately sent 2 consular commissioners and promised aid from the imperial treasury, the sheer logistics of clearing an entire mountain of rock dust from 2 major, deeply buried cities, Herculaneum and Pompeii, were simply insurmountable, a task that dwarfed even the greatest engineering feats of the Roman legions. The Bay of Naples, once the sophisticated, sun-drenched crown jewel of Roman leisure, had been violently redefined by the cataclysm. The coastline itself was altered, pushed outward by the massive pyroclastic flows that entered the sea, and the familiar silhouette of the mountain was now fundamentally, terrifyingly changed, its elegant cone sliced open to reveal the raw, destructive fury beneath. For the few hundred elite citizens who had survived the initial evacuation, now scattered refugees across the neighboring towns of Cumae and Neapolis. Looking back was like witnessing the sudden, total excision of their entire reality from the map of the known world. They carried the unbearable, flashing memory of a perfect life annihilated in a single day, a trauma so profound that it quickly became easier for the Roman state itself to let the ghost city remain buried. Initial frantic attempts were indeed made to dig tunnels, desperately hoping to retrieve priceless bronze statuary, or, more tragically, bodies that might still be recognizable. These efforts quickly proved futile. The ash was too unstable, collapsing frequently, too deep to excavate with standard tools, and the noxious, lingering gases occasionally seeping up from the cooling layers below created a lethal hazard for rescuers. They realized quickly that this wasn't a localized fire they could put out, or a flood they could drain away. This was a landscape irrevocably remade by a geological god, a powerful, silent declaration that Vesuvius was the true, ultimate sovereign of the region. The Senate eventually passed an order not to rebuild, but essentially to mourn and move on, acknowledging the impossible scale of the destruction by formally surrendering to the mountain's might.
This decree marked the official psychological death of Pompeii, turning the once vibrant resort into nothing more than a vast designated burial field, a place to be avoided, cursed, and eventually entirely forgotten by the living world. Over the next few decades, the slow, relentless geological healing process began its work. New layers of dust settled, rain washed the upper layers, and tenacious Mediterranean vegetation, always determined, began to creep across the vast sterile gray plains where forums and amphitheaters once stood.
New roads were slowly, meticulously built around the massive, sterile obstacle, and new, less ambitious settlements sprung up, intentionally avoiding the accursed ground where Vesuvius had demonstrated its ultimate, final power. The names Pompeii and Herculaneum faded from common usage within a generation, surviving only in fragmented provincial tax records and the occasional hushed warning whispered by old fishermen on the bay. The mountain, once a beautiful, wine-soaked backdrop for aristocratic parties, became the undisputed, terrifying sentinel, a constant, smoldering reminder of the fragility of human existence and the devastating consequence of willfully ignoring the seismic tremors of fate. Within 150 years, long-distance travelers visiting the region would walk directly over the buried metropolis without the slightest hint of the civilization sleeping just feet beneath their sandals. The great Roman achievement, the jewel of Campania, was gone. It had not been defeated by barbarians or economic collapse, but by the quiet, overwhelming force of nature, sealed away in a perfect time capsule of rock and fear, an accidental museum awaiting a discovery that would not happen for nearly 17 agonizing centuries. The air was no longer choked with fire and ash, but with a terrifying, profound silence that stretched across the Bay of Naples like a shroud woven from volcanic glass. Pompeii was gone, completely erased. Where once had stood the bustling heart of Campania, the pinnacle of Roman excess, there was now only a desolate lunar plain, stretching miles in every direction, blanketed by 6 meters of stone and powder. But what about the empire? Rome, the eternal city, was a master of logistics and immediate response, at least when the disaster was political or military. News traveled slowly, relayed by desperate messengers on scorched roads. When the official reports finally reached the Emperor Titus in the capital, detailing not just a regional disaster, but the complete annihilation of 2 thriving Roman cities and several towns, the shockwave was immense. Titus, a generally compassionate emperor, was reportedly deeply disturbed witnessing the first major natural catastrophe of his reign. He immediately declared the affected area a locus religiosus, a sacred or cursed place, and dispatched a relief effort, Crete. Think about it. How do you dig out an entire metropolis buried under 20 feet of freshly hardened rock and compacted ash? The logistical nightmare was insurmountable. Teams were sent, yes, to assess the damage, but their task quickly devolved into something far more gruesome. Salvaging what little wealth they could access near the surface, and perhaps most disturbingly, attempting to delineate the new shoreline. The harbor of Pompeii, once a vital artery of commerce and pleasure yachts, was now miles inland, choked with solidified mud and deep layers of lapilli, its function utterly lost to history. The sheer volume of material ejected by Vesuvius was staggering, an estimated 4 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice thrown into the stratosphere. This wasn't just a fire or an earthquake. This was the reshaping of the earth itself, a cataclysm that momentarily humbled the greatest civilization the world had ever known, forcing them to confront their own smallness against true geological time. Rome's immediate focus pivoted toward Herculaneum, which, ironically, was marginally easier to access for basic salvage operations because the material covering it was slightly softer, though still rock-hard. But Pompeii, buried under its dry, deep layers of lapilli and fine ash, was a lost cause from the start, a coffin too heavy to lift. They tried, of course. Imagine the desperate, futile efforts of those initial Roman recovery crews, hacking away at the stone, trying to find the familiar streets, the forums, the temples they knew, guided only by vague memory. After agonizing weeks of backbreaking, fruitless labor, the horrifying reality set in. The city was simply too deep. The cost of labor, the constant danger of lingering gases and unstable ground, and the sheer impossibility of the task forced Titus to make a chilling, pragmatic decision that would seal Pompeii's fate for millennia. The area had to be abandoned. Not officially forgotten, perhaps, but certainly written off the balance sheet of the empire. Rome had vast territories, countless other cities to manage, and the political necessities of the empire always superseded a single, geographically challenging tragedy. The emperor allocated funds to help the displaced citizens of the region rebuild nearby, attempting to re-establish life along the coast. But the site of Pompeii itself became a forbidden zone, a ghost story, a place marked only by vague governmental maps, labeling it the buried place. And so, the greatest testament to Roman life, a thriving, arrogant metropolis, was consigned to oblivion, sinking slowly beneath fields of new, strange vegetation that began to sprout with alarming rapidity from the hyper-fertilized volcanic soil. Farmers returned, tentatively, planting their seeds directly atop the silent rooftops of the dead. They were unaware, completely oblivious, that they were tilling the air above marble mosaics, gold jewelry, and sleeping frescoes, living their mundane lives just feet above a perfect, petrified moment of violent death. The road markers, which had pointed proudly toward the Porta Marina and the Forum of Pompeii, were eventually taken down or simply crumbled away, victims of weather and neglect, and the ultimate enemy, indifference. The very name of the city began to fade from common memory, becoming a footnote in obscure provincial records, overshadowed by the continuous flow of Roman history, military campaigns, and political intrigue. Generations passed. The small hills covering the site were assumed to be natural formations, the remnants of a peculiar ancient eruption perhaps, but certainly not the tomb of 20,000 souls, their memory perfectly preserved, yet utterly silent. The volcanic dust provided phenomenal fertility, ironically accelerating the masking process. New villas and farms were built over the ancient city, their foundations unknowingly resting on the roofs of the buried houses, treating the ground as nothing more than prime agricultural land. This was the final, devastating irony. The willful, arrogant perfection of the city of Pompeii, designed to last 1,000 years, was erased from human consciousness within a mere century. 17 centuries, in fact, would pass before the accidental scrape of a shovel or the tunneling ambition of an engineer would hint that something magnificent, terrifying, and utterly silent lay waiting beneath the quiet Italian fields. They had ignored the warning rumblings for 17 years before the eruption, a period of arrogant complacency. But the world ignored the city's grave for 1,700 years after the eruption, a cruel symmetry of profound historical forgetfulness. The mountain had achieved total victory, not just in destruction, but in maintaining an agonizing, protracted silence. The story of Pompeii became the story of waiting, frozen in time, protected by the very substance that killed it. And as the Roman Empire began its long, complex decline, as emperors came and went, and the focus shifted from conquest to survival, the vivid memories of the perfect resort city, the epicenter of luxury and sin, dissolved entirely into myth and soil. Only the mountain remained, standing guard over its silent, perfect collection of despair.